the Russian offensive is really anywhere you look, both in north and northeast of Kharkiv city, in the Luhansk Oblast, and in the Donetsk Oblast. They're really on a mark time offensive, and they're really only making micro gains. And if you the kind of words you use about the situation all along the front line really is either unchanged, trying to advance without success, or marginally advanced. So these are still just minor tactical gains, which really have no operational import. And there are a number of reasons for that. And the first thing is the impact of these weapons, and particularly not just the American weapons, but the sort of release authority of the weapons given by a number of Western nations. And by that, I mean the ability to strike, deeper into Russian territory. Because although at the moment Zelensky has been warning that there is still a grouping from the northern grouping of forces, which is 90 kilometers away from Kharkiv, essentially the second echelon of forces. You have to be able to bring that second echelon of forces to bear. And with the release authority, the Ukrainians have been able to strike troop concentrations, logistic builds up, road convoys, and things like that. So will they be able to bring this second echelon to bear when the first echelon is being mired in the mud? I don't think they will. Because one of the things that we've seen throughout this campaign is although that communications and digital profiles act and operate at the speed of light, we've really have people who are operating at the speed of a crawl in terms of the tactical opportunities. So all this means that the ability of the Russians to make offensive gains is really being inhibited. Now, the other thing which the American weapons and the release authority of the British and Swedish, French weapons has enabled is the Ukrainians to fight a far deeper campaign with the ranges in Crimea. Now that is significant because it's almost making Crimea untenable for the Russians in terms of strangling it as a logistic hub, pushing their air defense further away and their sea forces further away. And it is significant that only on the 10th of June there were a number of S-300 and S-400 air defense systems taken out by I think 10 American ATACMS systems, and the suggestions that the Russians are going to move their S-500 Prometheus, their anti-ballistic missile defense, into Crimea to try and have this air defense bubble around Crimea. Now that would be significant to see what the sword versus the shield would be in terms of the Russian air defense against Western technology and Western missile systems. One of the things that you can say about the S-300 and S-400, which have had quite a lot of export success for the Russians, is that it doesn't really work very effectively. And that's also been one of the reasons, for example, that it's not been turned on in support of the Syrian air defense profile when the Israelis have been attacking Iranian targets in Syria, the IRGC targets, over the last 4 or 5 years.
And what do you think the current Ukrainian strategy is regarding Crimea? Has it changed or does it remain the same? Because according to some analysts, for example, the need to take out the Kerch Bridge is no longer there. And you've mentioned those successes on strikes into Crimea itself.
Well, I think you've seen recently, again, a number of ferries being taken out, part of the logistic support route, as it were, to Crimea. I think that psychologically, dropping the Kerch Bridge would be helpful, but I don't think you will see it being dropped at the moment by the Ukrainians because you need to set the conditions for that operational and strategic success for dropping that bridge. And that is when Putin would really be on the back foot because, again, it's the politics of Crimea from a Russian perspective that actually matter. It was that sort of notion in 2014 that he was raising up and gathering in the Russian people by annexing Crimea, and therefore everything from there on in would be a walkover. And of course, that's not been the case. So if Crimea goes and is untenable, then Putin potentially loses power. And that's always really been either directly or indirectly the Ukrainian notion of victory, really, in the same way that Russia understands that it can't take over geographically all the territory of Ukraine. And its theory of victory goes along the lines of disrupting the willpower and determination of the West to support Ukraine, and therefore leading to a settlement which is on Russian terms. And that's really the big divergence that you've seen in the last week or so with the Russian notion of a peace plan versus Zelensky's notion of a peace plan in Switzerland last week. The S-500s are there. The Russian S-500s, again, is potentially a weakness of moving them down to Crimea, because the S-500s are there to be part of the anti-ballistic missile defense of Moscow replacing a system in the future. But it's always a political necessity to protect your capital. And then I think the Ukrainians need to protect those areas which are, far away from the front line, because that gives you your rear area security. It's where people can live in more sort of harmony, not be psychologically under pressure, and take it from there. So, the capital is always the first thing. Your supply routes in from Europe and your other major cities, Lvov in the west, but there'll never be enough air defense to go everywhere. Coastline is coastline around Odessa and Kherson Oblast is also significant, because there's no doubt in my mind that the Russians would really have liked to take the complete sea bridge and make the coastline a Russian lake again. And I don't think they've got any chance of doing that either.
How do you expect the war to develop over the summer months? And do you think that the combination of US aid, the new ability to use foreign weapons in a limited way inside Russia, these developments, could it mean that the most dangerous point has been passed for Ukraine this year?
Yeah, I think the most dangerous point for Ukraine is passed. But again, it comes back to how wars end. Neither side is going to be strong enough to conquer the other in military terms or military geographic terms. So if you go back to the Second World War, Eisenhower's directive, because we've just had D-Day, was to, with allies, to go to the heart of Europe and destroy the German armies. You're not going to see Russia in a position to do that. Neither are you going to see Ukraine in a position to do that to the Russian army. And therefore, you go back to how wars end. And they end in three ways. Firstly, by decisive military victory. Chances of that are still pretty low. The second one, because of the indecisiveness of military victory, which leads to some sort of negotiation. That's not on the cards at the moment. Or the third one, which is going to be on the cards for both of them at some stage, but not yet, is because either the political, military, sociological, population, economic, social, cultural, social, economic, whatever you want, costs are too great to one side, and therefore the will and determination to go on is diminished to a point where you need to have a settlement. Essentially, that's what happened with the destruction of the will of the Russian army in 1917, leading to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And you could posit, I don't think it's likely at the moment, that with 1,200 casualties a day on the Russian side, with very marginal gains, you could get to a point when the Russian military walk off the battlefield. I don't think we're going to see that yet. The second one is, of course, is the centrality of Crimea to the myth of Russian imperialism. If that becomes untenable, then the elites in Russia could say enough is enough. Putin and his cronies need to be overthrown. And the final one is that the population of Russia has had enough and rise up and sort of dethrone him. Now, to do that in a dictatorship is very, very difficult, but historically you only need 3.5% of the population to take to the streets and show their massive dissent to bring about some meaningful change, as we saw, for example, in the revolutions in 1989, which deposed Ceausescu and some of those other Eastern Bloc countries. Neither of those, I think, is tenable in the next sort of 3 months, though.
China's playing very carefully. And I've also, I really, really believe that China's playing a waiting game because Russia is weakening itself with this war. It's suicidal economically. They're taking advantage, but they're not going too far. They keep making friendly talks with Europe and America because that's where their customers are. And so I think China is playing a waiting game, hoping that Russia loses the war and/or is defeated, and then it's very possible they can get Manchuria back, which is something that they have long since talked about. 200 years ago was swiped from China by a czar. And they want Manchuria back, which includes Vladivostok, by the way.
And we talked about that, didn't we, Diane, last time that we spoke. How would you judge current relations between China and Russia? Because they did not send us, and you wrote about this as well, a significant delegation to the St. Petersburg International Forum, Russia's Davos, which actually coincided with D-Day commemorations. And Putin was saying Russia was fostering an alternative to the American-dominated global financial order. But what did the attendants say about his influence and that alternative?
Well, I think that, we're seeing the incredible shrinking Russian image here. Between that showcase conference he holds every year and the poor attendance by global South nations, also including India and others, and the fact that, he's making a big deal about visiting a pariah in North Korea, indicates, and the fact that he'll be arrested. He couldn't go to the BRICS conference. He couldn't go to the G20 because he faces arrest as a war criminal. I mean, it's the incredible shrinking Putin and his empire that I hope we're seeing, and that seems to be obvious. And he makes a big fanfare and lots of pomp and circumstance and lots of propaganda and rhetoric. But the fact remains that that country is going to go out of business.
Because, he's wanted by the ICC, but he's able to travel to Vietnam. And that is one of the complaints, I think, perhaps unsaid about him making these kind of trips at the moment. It kind of normalizes him as a leader, or is that what he's attempting to do, at least?
I think exactly that. I think that's what I am a leader. I have state dinners thrown for me. There's pomp and circumstances. I get to review their troops. I'm a big deal. That's what it is. And he's got to keep that going.
So the G7 summit agreed to release $50 billion worth of profits on frozen Russian assets by way of a loan to Ukraine. And the EU has now agreed a 14th sanctions package against Russia to further deny Russia access to key technologies, strip it of further energy revenues, tackle its shadow fleet and shadow banking network. How much is that going to hurt Putin and his inner circle?
I think that hurts them. The noose is tightening. There's no question. Diplomatically, economically, and militarily. The weapons are flowing. The Ukrainians are doing better. The losses apparently are staggering in Russia, not that he gives a damn. But the point is that the noose tightens. I think the assets is very important. It's a very important first step. And that, of course, is going to rattle his inner circle, because it was threatened, but they didn't believe they'd do it. And they've kind of done it, but not seizing the assets. They haven't confiscated the assets. And they haven't done that because they don't want to start, creating a precedent where the world doesn't like Americans and they seize American assets inside their country. So that was the reason for that. But this is a blow. And I would like to see the next blow. I would really like to see his oligarchy gone after. I would like to see them harassed and denied visas and stripped of citizenships and, just generally repelled around the world, have their properties seized, have to fight for them in court. I think that they don't have power, but I think that could help rattle the regime in Russia a little bit.
So, Diane, you write prolifically about geopolitics. I'm just wondering, from your point of view at the moment, what is the thing that is kind of like preoccupying your attention the most? What is the thing that concerns you the most? Putin.
I think Putin is a scourge. I think Putin is the new Hitler. I think Putin lives and breathes and sleeps, dreaming up ways to light fires all over the world, to upset and kill people. He really has to be removed somehow from his job, because I think he's a one-off. And I think that there isn't another one in the wings, or I hope. And so I think Putin is the biggest challenge. And then, of course, there are other challenges, such as, climate and economic reform and poverty. But right now, this one gets fixed, or the world is in for more and more trouble.
Let's turn now to your latest piece in your Substack series, and it's looking at something not really reported in the Western media, a Ukrainian special forces attack on Russian mercenaries in the Golan Heights in southwestern Syria. What happened and why were they targeted?
They were targeted because the Ukrainians have been monitoring the Russians wherever they are, and they've around the world, the Wagner mercenaries as well as Russian special forces. And they had noted that increasing numbers, and this is going back for a while, increasing numbers of recruits were being trained, recruits from the Middle East, Africa, wherever, were being trained in Syria by Russians, Russian mercenaries and Russians. And they were given Russian passports and they were shipped up to Ukraine to fight against Ukrainians in the war. And so they were concerned about this. And so they decided to dismantle the training operations, and they pretty much did. And this was a very important and necessary thing to do. But what it opened up my eyes to, and should to the rest of the world, is that Russia is using Syria, which is a failed state. I mean, it was absolutely ruined in the civil war that began in 2011. But it occupies a big part of the country, has military bases there. We don't know how many thousands of soldiers, and they're exporting all kinds of terrorism and problems. And the indication was that the Ukrainians had seen that mercenaries in Syria were training before October 7th to attack Israel, told Israel. Israel did not heed the warning, and the rest is history. And so they were doing this to attack a source of training and terrorism coming out of Syria by Russia, and they just wanted to interdict.
And it seems that this attack by Ukrainian special forces was carried out without any complaint from Bashar al Assad, the Syrian president.
I don't know. I don't read his press. I don't even think he has press. Look, it's a failed state. Essentially, in return for getting help from Moscow to fight the democratic forces in Syria in their civil war, he ceded Russia probably, I don't know, a third or half the land. It's a no man's land that Russia occupies, and it uses as a staging ground. It also is now getting into other aspects. It's now moving armaments to Libya. This is its next attempt to move closer and circle Europe, frankly. And they hope to establish a naval base in Libya, where there's a dictator who's kind of out of control. And you know, that's got a lot of people, and should get a lot of people in NATO concerned, because they could attack Europe easily from Libya.
Judging from the Kharkiv offensive that we can say it collapsed, Putin realizes that, first of all, he needs more support. That's why he went to the North Korea, and first of all, it was a sign of desperation, in my personal opinion. Another thing is, apparently, he will stick to his promise to arm the regimes that are hostile to the Western world, and this is what we see.
And there is speculation that there may be some kind of formal security agreement to come out of this meeting between Putin and Kim in North Korea. How worried are you about a formalizing of the relationship between North Korea and Russia?
It concerns me in terms of, I would say, more global scale, because it's a known fact that North Korea was bringing weapons to Russia. They were delivering millions of artillery shells, also ballistic missiles that were used, which was confirmed by the Security Service of Ukraine. But on a larger scale, of course, because they were talking about exchanging their military technologies and intel data and things like that. I think this escalates the threat not as much for Ukraine as for South Korea and our Western friends.
Yeah, do you think the summit was a success in the end?
It was a big success. It was only a first successful step because there will be new meetings, new agreements with our partners. I really hope that the number will grow. And what was very, very important on this very summit is the resolution adopted to ensure the nuclear security, ensure the freedom of navigation, and broader access to food supplies, because Russia is blocking Ukrainian grain, and it hopefully will be delivered to the countries that need this grain. And the countries that refused to sign this agreement, I think it basically damages their own international reputation, because there was nothing related to I don't know, military actions, military operations. It was literally a summit dedicated to resolving humanitarian issues. So basically, countries of so-called BRICS, they refused to sign this resolution. And I believe that it shows to a lot of people what BRICS is really about, because it's obviously not about improving quality of life, right, in those countries. It's about political terror conducted by totalitarian regimes like Russia.
Let's come on to the situation on the front line in Ukraine at the moment. What is your general assessment of it? And crucially, do you think the Russian offensive in the northeast has stalled now?
Yes, there are evidence confirming this, but today our man from the ground reported that Russians started 5 more assaults, 5 more offensives in the area of Toretsk. They had tactical success. Also, they escalate, they activate their efforts towards Kramatorsk, Chasiv Yar. In those areas, I believe that we will see most of the action. But again, according to our guys, they have, this impression that Russians bet everything on the upcoming 2-3 months, and they formed several offensive groups and tried to use them to gain success in Donetsk region. So apparently we will see a lot of action in those areas. It's Chasiv Yar, it's Toretsk, Vovchansk not so much, because Kharkiv offensive stalled. It collapsed basically. It's very, very hard to take control over a major city, which Russia failed during these 2 years. Just to remind our viewers, there are 22 major cities in Ukraine under Ukrainian control, and it was like that since 2014. And since 2014, despite all their efforts, Russians didn't manage to take control over any of the major cities. Kherson was taken initially, but they lost it. And currently, they don't control any of those cities that were under Ukrainian control. I'm talking about major cities, regional centers that were under Ukrainian control in 2014.
It's really interesting you mentioned how, the next 2 or 3 months you think is going to be crucial, and that's potentially when Russia is going to launch a fresh offensive. I suppose that begs the question whether the full effect of the US military aid will have been delivered in time to help defend against that offensive, and indeed to launch potential counterattacks and strikes inside Russian territory. How do you assess that at the moment, Operator Starsky, in terms of the delivery of the US aid?
I estimate that most of the promised munitions will be delivered very, very soon in the upcoming months. And of course, Russians also anticipate arrival of F-16 jet fighters. So they realize that this situation is very, very dangerous. And again, they will concentrate majority of their efforts around Donetsk Oblast. I believe that we will see a lot of combat there very, very soon.
In recent days, Ukraine has struck Russian oil depots in Rostov Oblast and also Krasnodar Krai using domestically produced Neptune missiles. Now, obviously, those sites are within the range of US-provided ATACMS, but Ukraine isn't allowed to use the ATACMS in those territories because of the restrictions that the US has placed on where Ukraine can use its weapons. Obviously, they have moved on that issue, and they have now allowed Ukraine to use American-supplied weapons to hit targets inside Russia, but still with those limitations. How frustrating are those limitations still? And do you have any optimism that America at some point will make a further concession and allow Ukraine to use US-supplied weapons in more parts of Russia?
The frustration is present to some extent, of course, because even considering that we are allowed to use Western munitions to strike Russian military targets on the Russian territory, but again, we're talking about the close rear, so to say. It's approximately 40-50 kilometers deep into the Russian territory. Unfortunately, we require much munitions with much longer range, like ATACMS, to strike important targets. Plus, we have full intel on those targets at this point. But unfortunately, it's impossible. That's why we keep using Ukrainian-produced drones. We keep using Ukrainian-produced missiles as well. As for Neptune, this missile has been modified. Again, just to remind our viewers, Russian flagship Moskva 2 years ago was destroyed using just 2 of those missiles. We know that they are being modified. We're talking about increased range, increased warhead. But until we are given the green light to strike Russian strategic objects deep in their rear, in their operator rear, we will have to deal with increased amount of Russian invaders here on the ground. And this is very dangerous because we cannot use those missiles to eliminate Russian personnel. They're not supposed to be used like that. We are talking about destroying Russian ammunition storages and fuel storages. Currently, we don't have enough potential to do that effectively. But I hope that things will change because, again, as we can see, the support for Ukraine is only growing. More and more countries agree to support Ukraine in our fight against the Russian aggression. So I have hope that this will change as well. There's no other way.
Why do you think Vladimir Putin has chosen this moment to visit North Korea?
I think there's an element of desperation in it. He's come to depend upon North Korea for the supply of weapons, for artillery shells, for ballistic missiles, some 11,000 containers worth of weapons, according to the Americans. He's in desperate need of these armaments. North Korea is perhaps the only country in the world in a position to be able to supply them because it has such an enormous stockpile of its own, not all of it in the best of shape. And it's also a pariah state. It's a state which has been shunned by the world for decades. It's a state which starved to death millions of its own people and is possibly the most repressive place on the planet. So it's in dire need of the attention, and Putin is desperate enough to supply that attention.
And Kim Jong-un did visit Vladivostok last September, but this is the first time Putin has gone to North Korea itself since 2000. So the fact that it's Putin going to Kim, does that speak to Putin's desperation?
It does. I mean, we're seeing a big reception for him, the flags, the pictures on the streets. I mean, the North Koreans are making a big thing of it. When Kim Jong-un went to the Far East, to the Russian Far East last year, Putin took him to a space facility because Kim is desperate for technology to improve the launching of satellites, as he would describe it. But of course, that same technology can be used on long-range ballistic missiles, which he would dearly like to develop. to carry nuclear warheads. So there's a lot at stake. That he wants Russian technology, he wants more advanced Russian weapons, he wants the international recognition that a visit by Putin would supply. But, Putin's running risks, because here he is writing an article for a North Korean newspaper, which sounds like a big deal, but there aren't many North Korean newspapers, effectively identifying his struggle against the West with that of North Korea. And that is a bit of a risk, because you're associating yourself with, there are a few despots who are bigger than the North Koreans, and to associate so closely with them runs other sorts of risks as well.
Talking of the weapons that North Korea has been supplying Russia, how are they being used on the front line in Ukraine?
It's mainly artillery shells, because a lot of the technology which the North Koreans have is not terribly advanced, but there's a lot of it. And there's a big shortage of artillery shells on the battlefield in Ukraine. There's been some doubt about how effective, because they've been in storage, they've not been looked after as well as perhaps other countries would. North Korea has a lot of stuff, but it's not always the first generation stuff. Of course, this gives them the ability to test a lot of that in a battle situation. The Russians are in desperate need of artillery shells, as indeed are the Ukrainians. And here's North Korea being one of the few places on the planet with a sufficient surplus to keep the Russian guns ticking over. And of course, we seem to be also, if according to American briefings, short-range ballistic missiles have also been supplied. And this has been confirmed by information that has come from the battlefield, from Ukrainians who've identified the North Korean markings on these munitions.
How effective are the munitions as well that North Korea provides?
That is debatable. We have seen Ukrainian sources say they're not very accurate. A lot of them don't go off. The fuses are duff. It's not the most effective weaponry, but I don't think the Russians particularly care.
They'll take it.
They'll take it. They need it. And accuracy is perhaps not something that they've been particularly bothered with. The purpose of a lot of these bombardments is to create terror. It's to lob these into cities. They're not really into pinpoint accuracy. The purpose is different. And they're so, if you're getting these shells in the quantity that the North Koreans appear to be supplying, then okay, a proportion of them don't work. A proportion of them go awry. But in the bigger scheme of things, that doesn't really matter to the Russian war machine, which has never really been into pinpoint accuracy and has never really been about avoiding civilian casualties.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, Russia throughout seems to have been pursuing the strategy of just throwing everything it can at the front line, including men. You look at the casualty rate, it's enormously high, but doesn't particularly seem to deter Vladimir Putin. He'll pursue the meat grinder strategy if necessary.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a few other places on the planet, or a few other countries on the planet, which would accept that, the extent of the attrition that we've seen in the Russian army. And I think this very much fits in with the Russian approach to warfare. The accuracy of these things at the end of the day doesn't really matter. It's the quantity of them. It's the fact it can fire them. The fact that people get hurt, the fact that they are not very accurate is neither here nor there.
Obviously, Russia and North Korea are both part of this sort of alliance of authoritarian states in China, Russia, Iran and North Korea. How significant is that alliance, and what are the dynamics inside it?
It's fascinating, because if you think back, it's not been that long that we've been talking about an alliance of autocrats. And when the term was first used, there was a lot of pushback. It was, well, no, they're not really. It's not like NATO, say, for instance, where you've got a defensive alliance held together by shared democratic values, which arguably is more solid. When you've got a bunch of autocrats trying to work together out of self-interest, it's not as stable as a defensive alliance built upon shared values, in my opinion. But what you do have is a marriage of convenience. What you do have is particularly with Iran, North Korea, China and Russia is a series of states in whose interest it is to work together at the moment because of their anti-Western sentiment, because of their view of the world, because of their immediate self-interest. So it may be a marriage of convenience, but that makes it no less dangerous for it.
And of course, Russia, Iran, North Korea, all very consequential, but fundamentally, China is the dominant player. It was interesting, I was speaking yesterday on Frontline to the journalist Michael Bociurkiw, and he was saying that in his view, Xi Jinping could end the war in Ukraine with one phone call to Vladimir Putin. Do you think he has that influence?
Yes, without a doubt. I don't think that the war in Ukraine would be sustainable without Chinese support. China is effectively underwriting the war through its massively increased trade with Russia, whether that's buying Russian oil, gas, supplying machine tools, chips, drones, dual-use items, items which can help rebuild and sustain Russia's military-industrial base. But China has the upper hand. Only a week or two ago, discussions over a new gas pipeline, which would bring Russian gas from its European fields to China, stalled over price because the Chinese wanted it at a very cheap price, which the Russians weren't prepared to move to yet. They may well do because they really have no choice, because that gas can't go to Europe anymore. So China is very much the dominant partner and the dominant element of this alliance of autocrats. And there's no doubt, in my view, that the war in Ukraine could not be sustainable by Russia without the support it's getting, direct and indirect, from China.
Putin going to Pyongyang. Does that speak to the fact that Vladimir Putin is now an international pariah in the same way that Kim Jong-un is?
Most definitely. I mean, and I think this is almost, he said it in his own words, that here is a country, a dictator, who is the ultimate pariah, who's been treated as a despot over the last decades. And here is Putin going there and closely identifying himself and his struggle with the West with that of North Korea, with that of Pyongyang. And I think that that is going to be something which could potentially backfire on him, especially among those who've perhaps bitten their lip and thinking, well, we don't really want to get involved in this. We don't really want to overtly oppose what Russia is doing in Ukraine. I think a lot of countries will be genuinely horrified at the thought of this tightening alliance between Russia and North Korea, especially if we see emerging from this some sort of beefed up statement of a more formal relationship, a more formal type of exchange of trade or technology, perhaps even military technology to North Korea.
China is in the background propping up Russia's war machine, pretty sophisticated drone technology, chips, things like that. So, they don't exactly have their hands clean here. But I do like to think that it's in their best interest to have a more stable world, more stable economy, and see that this war ends. And one more point, a lot of people forget that before the war started, Mr. Zelensky referred to China as one of Ukraine's biggest economic partners. So they have interest too, minerals, energy, that sort of thing.
What do you think it would take to get Beijing to the point where they would actually, when Xi Jinping would make that call to Vladimir Putin and say, look, now is the time to withdraw from Ukraine, now is the time to end this war? Because some might say, actually, a destabilized West, Europe at war, is actually in China's strategic interest.
Oh, you're absolutely right. I mean, look at the shenanigans they're up to in the South China Sea, or what the Filipinos call the West Philippine Sea. But I'll tell you what the red line is going to be, and God forbid that we reach that point, and that is when Mr. Putin's forces either tinker with the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which they occupy, and there's a release of nuclear there, or if Putin uses tactical nuclear weapons or other nuclear weapons. That will be the red line, I believe, and China will demand an end to it because they've made that pretty clear. I know there's a lot of ifs in all of this. We also have to remember that at the Olympic Games in China, Putin was reportedly asked by Xi Jinping whether he's going to invade Ukraine, and he said no. He actually lied to him. So there's no givens here, but all of us, I'm sure, agree that Russia should not be allowed to cross a certain line, and that's when China will really put its foot down.
Is Russia slowly becoming more isolated internationally? I mean, we talked about those countries that abstained and the BRIC nations, China not attending. There is a lot of speculation that Vladimir Putin may actually visit Pyongyang this week and make his first visit to North Korea in more than 20 years. Obviously, that's an increasingly significant alliance. Is Putin building more alliances, or is he becoming more isolated globally?
Yeah, and by the way, that North Korea visit, that'll be the first leader to come to Pyongyang since COVID, so it's a big thing on both sides. I was recently in Thailand, and my head was just shaking all the time because I could not believe the amount of Russian tourists and Russian expats actually living there. And they're already so entrenched, they're already said to be controlling some key sectors of the economy in places like Phuket. But you go, for example, to Phuket Airport, and it looks like a regional Russian airport. Flights to Vladivostok, Moscow, and elsewhere. And I stood there for a while, and I counted 2 or 3 Boeing aircraft under Russian flags and an Airbus. So I thought that both manufactured had stopped supplying spare parts to Russia. Now, I know they're probably trading behind the door through countries like Gabon and UAE and Thailand, but it goes to show you how much they've been able to avert these sanctions, to work around them. But also, it goes to show you that when it comes to countries like Thailand, like Turkey, like the UAE, like the Maldives, they rely very, very much on Russian trade and Russian investment and Russian tourism. And that has helped Mr. Putin, bust these sanctions, as have countries which have provided ships that allow him, for example, to ship illegal oil and stolen Ukrainian grain. So, yeah, it's sanctions are a tough thing. Isolating a country as big as Russia is a very tough thing as well, especially if main players don't want to take part.
On the topic of sanctions, Michael, last week the G7 agreed to use frozen Russian assets to raise $50 billion for Ukraine. Meanwhile, the US and Ukraine have also agreed a 10-year bilateral security agreement. What do you make of those, and do either of them go far enough?
Well, the one regarding the frozen Russian assets, primarily in Europe, and using the interest from that to back a loan to Ukraine, that to me represents a big deal. That is a break in the ice of Western leaders' fear to actually use those Russian assets. So that's a real big positive. The Ukrainians would like them to go further and use I believe it's 300 billion, but I think we'll see a drip, drip, drip approach on that one. And also, you'll remember it was referred to as a loan, and I think that was used to not set off alarm bells in places like the European Central Bank, which is absolutely obsessed with protecting the integrity of the euro. In terms of the security pact with the United States, that was the biggest of many that had been concluded recently. But we have to remember that this is an executive agreement, so hence it's prone to cancellation by an incoming American president, such as a Mr. Trump. But it does send out a huge signal to Russia that what is happening between those agreements, between the use of the frozen Russian assets and other developments, is that these Western leaders, many of whom are advanced age and many of whom are facing elections and probably will not be reelected, but I think what they're doing is trying to kind of fireproof the Ukraine aid so that it's more predictable, it's more substantial. And the other thing they're wisely doing is making sure that it looks like aid to Ukraine is not coming from the pockets of taxpayers, rather it's coming from, for example, seized Russian assets. So that's a really positive development. Let's see also whether NATO comes together and also gets, I think it's about 30 or 40 billion a year in military aid to Ukraine. That would be a big game changer as well.
And that point about public support is a really good one, because whilst, among our audience here at Frontline with Times Radio and in the UK, there's a huge amount of solidarity with Ukraine, as we've seen from the recent election results for the European Parliament, the rise of populist right-wing parties, many of whom are skeptical at best, some outright opposed to further military aid for Ukraine. Managing public opinion in Europe and America is incredibly important.
Yeah, and a huge thing. And also immigration, as you know, migration is a factor. And, if the war gets worse, for example, places like here in Odessa, you're going to see another wave of Ukrainian asylum seekers headed for Europe. How is that going to go over? So I like to think that among these newcomers who lean a little bit more to the right, that there is a sense of pragmatism, that Europe, even without Ukraine as part of the EU, is much, much more integrated, much, much more prone to, destabilization. Something that can happen on the other side of the continent can affect the whole continent, actually, at the end of the day. So, and Giorgia Meloni, she's not exactly regarded as a centrist, but I think, hats off to her. She has led the discussions in a positive way to supporting Ukraine, to making sure that there's no further escalation. And I actually think after her performance, if you want to call that at the G7, that she's going to play a more leading role in Europe. And that's a plus, I think, for everybody. So, we're in pretty good hands. But again, if these leaders, who, again, many of them who are probably on their way out, can fireproof that aid to Ukraine so it's not as prone to these unpredictable election cycles, that would be fantastic.
The military aid clearly is incredibly important, but it was interesting. The Financial Times reported yesterday that Russia has now overtaken the US as Europe's main gas supplier. And so a cynic might say, for all the increasingly hawkish rhetoric, Europe essentially still hasn't come to terms with the fact that it needs to do more, and it maybe needs to take on some economic pain if it's going to stop Russia's illegal invasion.
Yeah, well, look, I think things are moving in the right direction when it comes to lessening energy dependence on Russia, especially when it comes to oil. Germany, as far as I understand, is not dependent at all anymore, and on these pipelines, for example. And then also the process of building LNG terminals on Europe's west coast to bring in more gas from the US has not gone as fast as one would hope. So, and just day before yesterday, the Moldovan foreign minister was here in Odessa, spoke at the Black Sea Security Forum, and the story of Moldova and how it's transformed itself and totally changed its energy dependence, looking more westward, is a big, big thing. It can happen a lot quicker than anyone thought. And if anyone has any doubt on how this has affected Kremlin finances, well, have a look at some of the statistics, because they're having to shop now for clients for their oil in countries that can't afford to pay the full price at the pump, if we can put it that way. So their income has gone way down. And also, we have to remember that the Russians have been forced also to switch their economy to a very wartime economy just to keep the war machine going. So many factors there. The Russian economy is a lot more vulnerable than before the war, before the full-scale invasion. And then, look, here in Odessa, which feeds about 400 million people worldwide, I was just at the port yesterday for the first time since the war started. And, that the throughput of grain and sunflower oil is almost at pre-war levels now. They're about to start container shipping again. And this has been done by a country virtually with no navy. So that's pretty darn impressive and also destroying about 30 to 40% of the Russian Black Sea fleet in Crimea, pushing Russian ships back. That has shown that Ukraine takes its role seriously as one of the main providers of food to the world. It shows that given the chance, they can inflict quite major damage on the Russians. So there are some pieces of good news here too that we're seeing happen.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to the Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.